it's really a Cockney tragedy. It's a very, very sad, god-awful story. The idea of it actually encouraging anyone, or anyone wanted to be like the Krays, is another part of the sadness, because it's something sad in our own society, which makes heroes of people like this.
Hello and welcome to another video. It has been a while since my last, so I may be a bit rusty. I kind of had a break from all things Kray, but here is another video. Today's video is about the popularity of the Kray Twins and the fascination with them over the years and what drives that. People with a keen interest in them, like me, or maybe like you who are watching this video. On the flip side of that, you have people that absolutely despise anything Kray. To them they are lowlifes and possible paedophiles who procured young boys for the social elites in the swinging 60s. Or they ruined the businesses of hard-working people in and around the area of Bethnal Green in East London. Some people have a mild interest in them. Others can be known as what is called Kray fans, who have a kind of hero worship towards them and see them as a couple of Cockney likely lads who done more good than harm. My position is kind of in the middle. This fascination with the Twins is not a new thing. It didn't just start after the release of John Pearson's best-selling book The Profession of Violence, or the 1990 film The Krays, starring Gary and Martin Kemp, or even after or during their huge public trial in 1969 at the Old Bailey. Of course, those things propelled the Kray Twins to a wider public to be fascinated with their lives, and especially the film in 1990. Things about the Krays seemed to skyrocket after that in what seemed an avalanche of Kray books during the rest of the 1990s. And while the books have slowed, they are still banging them out, at least one or two a year. You have to look back when the Twins were free men and active in criminal circles to see the start of people being fascinated with them. Long-time Kray friend Leslie Berman encapsulates this perfectly from a documentary on the Twins.
Say they used to come to the Astor. You could feel a certain atmosphere. The Kray Twins had arrived. That was the atmosphere that people got. I don't think it was fear. It was just, I suppose if the Queen was to walk in, every time I said, look, is the Queen there? There would, a feeling would arise.
People seem to be in awe of them back then, which isn't too far from people being fascinated with them today. Of course, not everyone who knew them talks of them in glowing terms, but most did. I feel most of their peers were in awe of them. It wasn't just Leslie Berman who talked of the Twins in glowing terms. The Till brothers, despite the bad that they do say about the Krays. Lots of Bobby Till's book Bringing Down the Krays, especially at the start of the book when Bobby met the Twins, he describes them in what only can be classed as hero worship. He comes across as in awe of them and lucky to be in the company of such villains. The Till brothers met the Twins around the Double R Club days, so you can see even then in the late 1950s and the very early days of the 1960s, the Twins had some kind of pull with people. It seems that even at that early stage in their criminal career, they were starting to be hero worshipped by their peers. Of course, the Krays were gang leaders. They had always been that ever since their early street battles in their teens and the early 20s. There will always be a certain respect that can be garnered from that, a faithful band of followers that will be at their beck and call and do any bidding that was asked of them. But the Kray Twins, you get the feeling of something different. We know Ronnie Kray had quite a personality. Despite his extreme erratic violence, he was, according to his peers around him at the time, very humorous. Reggie's personality seems to be, from what I can gather, rather dull and mostly very serious. Kray firm associate Mickey Fawcett said in his book Crazy Days that Reggie Kray had displayed no sense of humour whatsoever. I feel people would have gravitated to Ronnie more than Reggie. It seems Ronnie was more welcoming than Reggie. As we know, as the 1960s rolled on, the Twins not only gathered a following of fellow villains in awe of them, they also had a celebrity following, people as famous as Judy Garland, to lesser famous people such as painter Lucian Freud. A huge part of the Twins crossing over this boundary in the consciousness of the 1960s celebrities was due to a man called David Litvinoff. I have mentioned him before in another video, so I won't go too deep on him, but he straddled on the edges of the criminal world and the celebrity world in London's swinging 60s. David Litvinoff was a kind of party jester at parties of the Chelsea set. The Chelsea set were young, affluent young people that mixed with people like Mick Jagger, among others. It was all very fashionable and upmarket, with expensive properties in London's Chelsea area. Litvinoff would tell tales at these parties and play practical jokes. Lots of his stories that people enjoyed hearing about was what happened on the other side of the fence in the criminal world, and in particular stories about two twin brothers called Ronnie and Reggie Kray from the East End of London. These stories really set off the mythology of the Twins in people's minds that quickly spread word of mouth throughout celebrity London. David Litvinoff was known to be very economical with the truth on most things, and this is where the myths of the Kray Twins was born. And by the time David Bailey took those famous photographs of the Twins in 1965, the Kray Twins had almost crossed over to celebrity status themselves. The Twins were very good at courting publicity, but I feel they owe a lot to David Litvinoff for how famous or infamous that they became. David Litvinoff would later fall out with the Twins and be slashed across his face. It is not 100% known if the Twins were involved in this, but they probably were, despite Litvinoff getting on the wrong side of a few people. Litvinoff would later kill himself with an overdose of sleeping pills in April 1975. I will add that David Litvinoff came into the Twins' orbit at the Twins Club Esmeralda's Barn, where he ran up huge gambling debts. By the time the Kray trial came around in 1969, the Kray Twins were daily news in the local and national newspapers. I think the main interest was still on a local London level, but big national papers like the Daily Mirror did run with lots of updates from their trial, and when the Twins and the firm were jailed in 1969, they did make the front page of the Daily Mirror. But despite this, they were not really newsworthy countrywide, and for most people this would probably have been the first time hearing about the Twins. John Pearson's Profession of Violence changed this somewhat when it was released in 1972. John Pearson had first hand of what the Twins were like after he spent some months with the Twins in their remaining months of freedom in late 1967 to early 1968 to research his book on them. By that time in 1967, the Twins were well aware of their celebrity status that had cultivated out of the stories of David Litvinoff, and they were not only thinking of a book of their lives but also of a film. In the 1970s there would be two films made independently of the Twins that were loosely based on them. One was Performance, starring Mick Jagger and James Fox, and the other was Villain, starring Richard Burton. David Litvinoff was hired as a dialogue coach and technical advisor for the film Performance through knowledge he gained from his friendship with the Kray Twins. There was a book before John Pearson's called The Rise and Fall of the Brothers Kray that came out in 1969 by Brian McConnell, but this didn't really make much of a splash as John Pearson's Profession of Violence. The professional violence, while popular, I don't think it really caught on too much at the time, and the twins were pretty much forgotten during the 1970s. Things ramped up a bit at their mother's funeral in 1982, and then there was the release of the twins' book, Our Story, which was written by Fred Dinenage in 1988. Things went to another level in the Kray Twins' popularity with the release of the film The Krays in 1990, starring two singers from the British pop group Spandau Ballet. Gary and Martin Kemp were cast to portray Ronnie and Reggie Kray. This was the moment the twins were propelled into the minds of the whole country. The Krays naturally disliked the film. Brother Charlie Kray was brought in to help with the production in an advisory role. The film was a huge success, winning a number of awards. The film made over £3 million at the box office. The seeds that David Litvinov had planted in those minds in the 1960s had come to fruition. Of course, it wasn't all down to David Litvinov. As we can see, the twins generated some ore before then, but I feel without David Litvinov's tall tales during those early years of the 1960s, I feel we could be looking at a different story as far as the Kray Twins are concerned and their celebrity status, if you like. From here on in, things really picked up. Countless books were released during the 1990s after the Kray film. The twins kind of green-lighted the rest of the firm to go ahead and speak about their life in the firm after the twins put out their book Our Story in 1988. I think the first to cash in was firm member Tony Lambriano with his book Inside the Firm in 1991. Then followed others, Albert Donahue, Jack Dixon, the blind beggar barmaid, Lenny Hamilton, who seemed to have taller tales to tell than even David Litvinov did back in the 1960s.
Someone at the back, they just shouted out, "No, Ron, not that." And he just, like that, switched off. He walked away.
These books are just a few that were written by people that were around the twins during their freedom. There were countless others from outsiders, journalists. The 1990s were a boom in true crime books of gangsters, and the most popular of all were the books on the brothers Kray, in the UK at least. True crime books about gangsters since then has become big business. Still to this day, at least 2 books on the Krays come out a year. We've had one already at the start of 2022, and I'm sure we will see at least one more this year. As well as books, the tabloid newspapers had a field day after the Kray film. There was constant stories in the newspapers like The Sun and the Daily Mirror written about the twins. Almost weekly, if not daily. Some of these stories were fed to the papers by the twins themselves, and if it wasn't the twins, it was former firm members like Tony Lambriano or friends of the twins like Dave Courtney. When we look at other villains from that era, it is really only the Great Train Robbery that has been talked about a lot, with quite a few books written about it, and despite at the time it being nationally more notable than the story of the twins, it still pales in comparison today in contrast to the Krays. Even the Richardson gang from South London, who were just as feared as the twins at the time, if not more, are not as popular today. In fact, Eddie Richardson brought out a book recently where he had to have the word Krays on the cover to maybe make it sell a bit more. That isn't a dig at Eddie Richardson, it's just, well, the Krays sell. That's a fact. The only other criminals that come close to the Kray Twins' popularity in the UK, in my opinion, are the Essex Boys, Pat Tate, Tony Tucker and Craig Rolfe. They were 3 drug dealers from the Basildon area of Essex that were shot dead while sitting in their Range Rover down an isolated farm track in the village of Rettendon in December 1995. A kind of hero worship seems to have grown up around these men from the younger generation, which can seem similar to the Krays. Countless books have been written about them. and like the Krays, some things are truths and some things are not true, so a myth has started to build up around them. The books, the films, the documentaries, it's all too familiar, and like the Krays, that story seems like it will just keep going, although there is more mystery surrounding that case rather than the cut and shut story of the Kray twins. So all this brings us to now, almost 22 years after Reggie Kray took his final breath. The legend of the Kray twins is as strong as ever. The film Legend, which was released in 2015, has made over £21 million alone in the UK since its release, and it brought in a whole new younger generation of Kray admirers. The film, which was acted superbly by Tom Hardy, eclipses the original 1990 film in the UK and worldwide. Arguably, it isn't as good as the original as far as the Kray purists go, but I think it's a bit split on that. Legend is still a very well acted, decent stab, no pun intended, at the Kray story, a bet from a very different angle. I still feel we are due a better film though, that does the Kray story more justice. While Legend is a decent film, I do prefer the 1990 film, but I'm still left wanting another big budget, well acted one. Unfortunately, the Kray film genre, just like the Essex Boys one, has become filled with too many low budget, pretty bad films since Legend, that I fear any good director or production company will steer well clear of the Kray subject for the foreseeable future. Of course, any discussion on the twins' popularity would not be complete without the other side of the coin, the side of the unpopularity. The Kray twins, after all, were villains, gangsters, murderers. They both done some terrible things. Like most things with the twins, it is hard to separate truth from untruth. Lots of people firmly believe that Ronnie and Reggie Kray were involved in sex trafficking of young lads to the socially elite politicians. It is said that the twins helped their own, but as far as we can see, they only hurt their own. Frank Mitchell, Jack McVitie, George Cornell, the businesses around the East End that the Krays extorted money from for protection, they was all their own, their community. But we have to think of the families of their victims. Where do they stand with all the Kray fandom and the hero worship? Their sons, husbands and brothers were murdered by these two men. In Frank Mitchell's case, they had a big hand in his death. It is not hard to see why people will despise them. It is more easy to see why people despise them than it is to understand how people hero worship them. If we was Frank Mitchell's family, we would find it all crass and an insult, but that could be said of any popular figure in crime that there had been books and films written about that hurt or murdered people. It isn't exclusive to Ronnie and Reggie Kray. I think the future of the twins in people's minds will be more of the same. We will get more books about them. There is more than likely a ton of stuff about them in the National Archives that has been left untouched. There are still things about the twins that are still confidential. Maybe these things will be about the young lads and the elite, and it will be an eye-opener for the people that worship the twins, and we told you so from the people who despise them. There will more than likely be some more films, although I feel of the low budget variety. The Kray twins have earned a special place in the minds of the public. They are up there with Jack the Ripper and Blackbeard, and will always be remembered as Britain's most famous gangsters. I see no signs of the Kray bandwagon coming to a halt. So that's it for this video. I hope you have enjoyed it. I don't think this is a very long one. It was just a little look at the Krays and their popularity and how the seeds were sown for that to happen. As always, I don't know when the next video will be. At the moment, it's just as and when. So thank you all for watching, and I will see you again in the next one. Thank you.
What better message can you put out to the would-be gangsters of today, or the criminals coming up? These are the heroes you look up to the youth, and say, well, look what happened to them. The three of them have all died in prison.
I find it hard to believe they're all gone, sitting here today. But it seems to me that that's the way it had to be, one or the other. It was a warning that if you do this, or you do that, this is what can happen to you. And I think that was the message left here over the years.